But in relation to this audience to the judge, what are the competitors? And I will just run also to try to find flaws ways of why it wouldn't work or why it would be disadvantageous or illogical or detrimental. Right? So that might seem a little conversational with liberal, right? Of course, it's expected from each side to really to really and that's
Is your left from my church?
And so what we're trying is for me is just give a summary of your stance. And then the later started to really go into the in-depth arguments of what you stand for. You have even though you're on the same side. That's perfectly fine. And it's perfectly fine to tell the audience your different perspective. But you shouldn't go so far as to say that your ally or the other speaker is wrong or anything like that, or to attack his speech. You can just give a somewhat differing constructive opinion. But it is almost your duty to try to find any way in which the opposition may not work. And yeah, I'm sure all of you know this. I just wanted to just say that as a reminder that everybody. Yeah. All right. Good luck.
If I could have everybody's attention, we're going to start in a couple of minutes, so if you guys want to take your seats. Couple means like 2. Hi, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the UW Students for Justice in Pakistan to our event, Clouds of Uncertainty, Tackling Terror. And today's debate will be on dialogue or direct action. So a little bit about UW Students for Justice in Pakistan. Our mission statement is to raise awareness about social issues in Pakistan in the Waterloo region in hope to enlighten and motivate minds. Some of the events that we held in the past have been a candle vigil for Arfa Kareem, a silent veil documentary night, an event called Western Intervention in Pakistan about drone attacks, another event called In the Name of Malala, the 15-year-old activist, UW United Against Sectarianism in Pakistan, Meet Pakistan Eliminates Stigma, which happened in with PSA last term, and today's event, Clouds of Uncertainty. So this is one of our efforts on campus with a video and photo series that we had lots of UW students participate in and raise awareness about issues in Pakistan. So today's program, there's a basic summary of events that have occurred in Pakistan that'll be given by Nishad, the debate that'll be monitored by Emerset, a brief discussion afterwards, and survey results. So a couple of announcements before I hand it over are please turn off your phones or turn them to silent. They're distracting during the debate. You have survey sheets in front of you or like on the seat that you've taken. Fill them up accordingly, and so tick the answer to the options below the before the debate section, and when prompted after the debate, fill in that part afterwards. And hold your questions till the end of the debate. We'll have a round dedicated to it, so keep note of your questions, and we'll give you time afterwards. Any other questions, please feel free to ask one of the volunteers, the execs, or myself or Rida, and we'll help you with it. And a disclaimer before we begin is that the views of the guest speakers today are respected, but might not be the ones held by UW SJP, just as clarification. So we'll let the debate begin, and I'd like to call up Nishad, who's going to do a brief summarization.
Thank you, Shifa. Before we begin the debate, I'd like to just go over some of the main events that have happened considering the Pakistani Taliban. So how they came into being. The Pakistani Taliban, or to be more politically correct, Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, are a coalition of various Islamist militant groups in the federally administered tribal areas in the northwest region of Pakistan, along the Afghan borders. They are presently led by Mullah Fazlullah. Now, they initially were supporters of the Afghan Taliban, who sought refuge in Pakistan's tribal area, who over time altered into a distinct entity in 2002. Now, they officially came into being, per se, in 2007, when about 17 militant groups who emerged under the umbrella of Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, led by Baitullah Masood of southern Waziristan, who's actually been accused for the assassination of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto in December 2007. Now, violence in Pakistan has been on the rise, particularly since 2007, as terrorist groups have targeted political leaders, the military, police, tribal leaders, minority groups, civilians, and schools. I'd like to take a moment to go through a rough timeline of a few of the many claimed and alleged attacks conducted by this terrorist group. Firstly, as mentioned before, the assassination of Benazir Bhutto in December 2007, which was confirmed by the US CIA in January 2008. Now, among the Pakistani Taliban, the most audacious attacks have been the bombings of, to name a few, Islamabad's Marriott Hotel in September 2008, which killed at least 60 people. and Peshawar's Pearl Continental Hotel in June 2009, in which 17 were killed. Now, the Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban, they have expressed transnational ambitions when they claim responsibility for a failed bombing in New York Times Square in May 2010. In September 21st, 2013, Pakistan had announced that Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar, who is one of the founding members of the Taliban, has been released from prison. From January 29 to February 13, the result were 15 attacks in 15 days. Currently, the state of affairs in Peshawar are more in turmoil than ever, mainly due to the first round of the peace talks. On March 15, there was another planned attack of 2 bombs targeting security forces in Peshawar, killing 19 people. This specifically occurring during the peace talks between the government and the Taliban militant. We know that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who began his 3rd term in June 2013, has railed against U.S. drone strikes as an affront to Pakistani sovereignty while advocating talks with the TTP. Now, we are all here because we all agree that terrorism is a criminal act, since no fight for justice can be justified by murders of innocent people. The question is how? How do we tackle terrorism, specifically in the case of the Pakistani Taliban? And to do that, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Emmer, who is going to be mediating this debate.
Hi, everybody. Let me just start here. Yeah, I'm the president of the UW Debating Society for this term, and I was asked by Danielle right here if I could moderate this debate. I said absolutely, and I've spent the last couple of weeks really doing a lot of research about this. I admit that I had really basic knowledge about this whole issue before, although it's absolutely interesting, and I know it's extremely deep, and there's a lot of history, and you can't possibly get to know the core issues in just 2 weeks of studying besides doing a bunch of other homework. And so I'm really looking forward to this debate and how this will play out and finding a bunch of great new information in this debate. There will be, I will be asking all 4 of the speakers here to give a brief 2-sentence or 3-sentence introduction into your background and everything, and so forth. Basically, brief introduction of yourselves. I will. We have the 2 speakers in favor of dialogue are Ali Zaidi and Zafar Bangash, and the 2 speakers in favor of direct action here are Saad Imtiaz. My apologies for any pronunciations, and Junaid Malik. And a couple things that I would want to remind the audience and the live audience as well is that there are 2 distinct sides to this argument, right? Which creates this dichotomy, which creates a great ground for debate. And there are many things that many people don't know, and there is a lot of opinion because we don't know the actual solution, which is the reason for this debate. But because we have almost unnaturally separated this into a dichotomy of either one or the other, it necessarily means that the solution may not be black and white, as any debate will necessarily be. Well, obviously this debate will not be so black and white, but what I mean to say is that the actual opinion of the speakers here may not be as strong as it is presented, because it is the role of the speakers in this debate to show the advantages of their side, to show the advantages of dialogue or of direct action, and also to question the advantages of the opposite side. And it essentially for you, all of you, to be the judges, to find out what side is better and to look at the pros and cons of both sides, which is why we have this debate. And so I just want to remind you that the actual personal perspective of each of these great speakers may not be as black and white as the role that they are expected to perform for you as the audience to find out both sides and find out the pros and cons of both sides. Also, the second thing I want to remind everybody is obviously not to shout down any of the speakers and not even to say to cheer or boo so much. Obviously, you know, clapping at the end of the speeches and so forth, and remember to write down any questions that you may have for any of the speakers on the side or all of them, so that we can have them at the end. And also remind you all, before the debate begins, to write down what your opinion is on this debate, on the papers that you have, and then to leave the second half of the paper until after the debate. And that's how we will decide how the audience is. And so, yeah, I would ask each of you, I guess, from the farthest until the nearest, to just give a brief introduction. Yeah.
Good afternoon, good evening, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zaidi. I'm a professor at Waterloo in the Department of Global Studies. And the kinds of things that I research and teach about have to do with the cultural side of globalization. My book, Islam, Modernity, and the Human Sciences, deals with the assumptions underlying social scientific knowledge, and it was a comparison of Western attempts at human sciences and Muslim attempts at the reconstruction of the social sciences. So religious and secular assumptions underlying knowledge. I teach a fourth-year seminar called Dialogue and Critique in an Age of Terror. So although this year we did deal a little bit with the Taliban situation, we deal with 9/11, Al-Qaeda, and similar issues. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Zafar Bangash. I live in Toronto. I edit this magazine, Crescent International, which has been published for now 43 years and in 3 countries. We deal with all of these issues that are going to be talked about today. I've also published a number of books. The latest one is Power Manifestations of the Seerah, examining the letters and treaties of the Messenger of Allah, which basically talks about resolving issues through negotiations and discussions rather than fighting. And so perhaps it fits into today's discussion, although I'd like to point out that I'm not a pacifist. In fact, if you Google my name, you'll find a lot of nasty things about me. I'm referred to as a militant and an unofficial spokesman for the Islamic Republic of Iran, and a Hezbollah front and a Hamas front, and all these things, which I take as compliments, of course. But we hope, inshallah, that this afternoon we can have an animated discussion. It's a very important topic, and I think we should be able to interact and learn a lot from each other. Assalamu alaikum.
Hello.
Turn that one off.
I think it's safe to talk now. My name is Junaid Malik. I am an electrical engineering student at the University of Waterloo. Born and raised in Pakistan. Moved here a couple of years before I started university here. My experiences are not as elaborate as the panelists here, but they are firsthand. I have seen the atrocities. I've seen what the Taliban have done in our country. And I would love to have this discussion, bring them together to talk about a reasonable solution to this sort of situation. My stance here is pro-action, and we shall see how this pans out at the end. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Saad Imtiaz. First of all, I apologize for the shoes I'm wearing. I couldn't find my brother. He has my dress shoes and he was nowhere to be found, so excuse me for that. I don't have any first-hand experience of Taliban, to be honest. I do have a take on it. I'm a graduate from University of Waterloo in economics, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion. Thank you.
Right, so the debate is going to be divided into 4 sections. First is going to be a 1.5-minute opening on for each of the speakers. And and the debate will always be divided into first one speaker on the section of dialogue, which I think it will start with Ali Zaidi. All right. And then it will go on to one speaker from direct action. In this case, the first speaker will be Saad Imtiaz. And then go on to the second speaker from dialogue, which is Zafar Bangash, and then the second speaker from direct action, Junaid Malik. All right, so 1.5 minute opening, which is essentially them giving their statements and what they stand for. And then 10-minute constructive, which is going into the depths of their arguments and showing you either historically or logically or other demonstrations of their arguments in their opening statements. And now this 10 minutes is a maximum, and you may very well give these this constructive argument of your idea below 10 minutes, and it's perfectly fine and welcome. Although it is a maximum, so we expect not to go above it. 7.5 minutes after that will be refutation, in which you will be directly questioning what the opposition side stands for, and then after that will be 7.5 minute reconstruction, which will be like answering the questions that were made out in the refutation. Again, these are maximum times. They may be less, and so forth. And after that, there will be questions of the audience for any clarification. And so this will drag on, which is why we're giving these maximum time limits and saying that you may go below these. All right. And so, without further ado, I would like to start the debate by calling out the first speaker on the side of dialogue, Ali Zaidi, to give his opening statement. Here.
Before you start the clock, let me just say thank you to the audience for turning out and for the organizers for organizing this. That is no doubt a hectic time for you. Professors are ripping their hairs out. You see, I'm losing that. And so I can imagine students are doing probably worse than me at this time as we come to the end of term. So thank you for organizing it. Let's start the clock. There's really no question that long-term peace and reconciliation can only come about as a result of the dialogical process. While there is no universally accepted definition of terrorism, terrorism is a weapon. It is a tactic of the weak. And let me also remind you, sometimes a tactic of the powerful, such as the states, such as a state. It is always an attempt to strike back when a party's grievances cannot be heard or ignored or are ignored. But underlying terrorism is always the search for recognition and legitimacy. Dialogue alone enables recognition and respect of the other, recognition of the other as worthy of being heard, without conceding that terrorist activities have been effective. The only reason we are having this debate is that we are all caught up in the rhetoric of the war on terror, which only works to convince the public that government leaders actually understand the problem. There is a known enemy, and that government leaders can contain it. That is why so many problems come to be framed as problems of direct action. The war on poverty, the war on drugs, and so on. The reality is, what is happening in Pakistan needs to be recast, not as a war on terror, but as a problem of recognition and legitimacy. The most effective means to deal with it is to deal with it through dialogue for recognition and legitimacy.
I'd like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon Saad Imtiaz to start the debate on his side of the house. Here.
First of all, thank you so much, Students for Justice in Pakistan, for having me on this platform. I would like to start off with saying something which might disappoint Emmer a little. My point of view, actually, and I had mentioned before, is not exactly pro-military, neither is it pro-peace. I do have a very different take on it. So don't consider this as a very big debate, consider this as a dialogue, and just hear me out. Maybe it is a new perspective that comes into light. I see conflict as a problem of the human mind. It is a problem that exists in very high form, whether it's terrorism, or it does exist in very small forms, be it in personal fights in different people. So I would like to tackle it from a psychological point of view of why we have conflict in the world and why this conflict is not solved, maybe because we don't understand the problem. So I would like to talk about conflict, how it's a problem in the world, and see different sides of it, see what solutions that we may be taking may not be working, such as military action or to some extent peace talks, and then perhaps once we've understood the problem, come up with a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. And I'd like to call upon Zafar Bangash to give his opening statement here.
For the moderator, just a quick sort of correction. My name is Zafar Bangash, so please let's get that sort of out of the way. I hope that will be okay. That's okay, no problem. I know that you know, my name has caused problems for a lot of people. You're not the only one, so that's okay. I think whenever we want to deal with an issue, we first of all need to define the problem. One of the difficulties is that the word terrorism has not been defined adequately at all. I think we need to not only define the term properly, but instead of treating the symptoms of this issue or disease, we should be looking at the root causes. As Professor Ali Zaidi pointed out, you know, you can either take a sledgehammer to an issue, or you begin to recognize the other side and you hold a dialogue. And in this discussion this afternoon, I think it's important that we examine the root causes of why terrorism emerges in the world, or anywhere for that matter, and whether the sledgehammer approach is really the right approach. As I said in the beginning, I'm not a pacifist, but I think we should be looking at finding solutions to the problem rather than exacerbating the problem. And I will argue, when I come to speak more elaborately, that all the actions that have been taken so far have in fact exacerbated the problem rather than reducing the problem. So I think we need to approach this in a different way and see whether we can find a solution, because ultimately it is affecting the lives of hundreds of millions of people, not only in Pakistan but all over the Muslim world. Thank you. Salam.
Thank you, Zafar Bangash. And I'd like to call upon Junaid Malik to give his opening statement here.
Hi. Just to reiterate, my name is Junaid Malik. My stance is pro-action. My stance is that dialogue right now is not only ineffective, but in this case, it is very detrimental. I would like to believe that that there is a problem right in front of us, and the problem is the Taliban, and they need to be dealt with. The civilian faith in the Pakistani government has been deteriorating over the years. For the past 2 decades, I believe, we've seen the emergence of these Taliban forces through the country, more and more secular violence, giving rise to more differences between ethnicities. The civilian faith has been deteriorating throughout the years, and if we see the government shaking hands with the Taliban at this point, it would only exacerbate that situation and lead to perhaps a civil war if we're not there yet. Well, my point is that military action is required. It's required fast, and it's going to be swift. We need directed action, action that's going to take out key members of each party. There's umbrella organizations that are holding on to other possible terrorist organizations that are being funded from external points. We need to consolidate Pakistan on its own, hold it, and strengthen it where it is, maintain its constitution, not defer from what we believe in, which is our constitution, and give in to something that an external force is asking us to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Junaid. And now I'd like to call back upon Professor Ali Zaidi to give his constructive maximum 10 minutes speech. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to make the following 3 points. One, I want to begin by saying that there's a deep-rooted cultural problem in Pakistan that regards the military and military action as signs of strength, and that regards dialogue and reconciliation as signs of weakness. What is required in Pakistan then, in dealing with the Taliban, is the overcoming of this deeper cultural problem for dialogue and reconciliation to take place, 1. 2, I want to point out that direct action has already been attempted to quash terrorist groups, and that has failed. 3, I want to give you 2 examples in which dialogue with terrorist groups has occurred and has been effective. And I will refer to the IRA and to ETA in Spain. So in Ireland and in Spain, we see dialogue with terrorist groups having taken place and having resolved problems. Now, before I get into these in detail, let me say, as I did in the introduction, there's a problem of recognition. When the first speaker came up, the presenter of the chronology of events came up, the Taliban are only being identified with certain specific terrorist events that were listed. This is already framing the picture in a particular point of view, in a particular way. It is already misframing what the Taliban is or who the Taliban is, as though they are only a terrorist action or a terrorist group. So this is fundamentally a problem of recognition, or of, I would say, misrecognition. Now, let me begin with my 3 points. I think the deepest problem that prevents dialogue from occurring is the cultural problem in Pakistan. Pakistanis, throughout our history, regard military strength and victory as the only way to deal with our problems. Having engaged with India over issues of Kashmir and even from independence, Pakistani society and culture, especially in certain classes, is still deeply, largely enamored by the military and still deeply enamored with military solutions. After all, more than half of our budget is dedicated to defense. And if you question this, people cannot swallow that. You could reduce the defense budget and allow for other kinds of things, like education, which would actually help us toward dialogue. People may criticize military dictatorships, but they cannot fathom a reduced role for the military. Dialogue would displace the role for the military. Pakistanis are not ready for that. In fact, I would say it is the Taliban that is still closely connected to the notion of dialogue. Indeed, it is the Taliban that has tribal councils and loya jirgas where people get together to sit down and talk and to try to resolve their problems. The culture of the Taliban is closer to dialogue than the culture of the Pakistani state, and the military, and the intelligence services. In any case, sooner or later, all governments, almost all governments, in almost all cases, do engage with dialogue with terrorist groups. They may deny them initially, they may reject them initially, but over time, as in the case of the IRA, in the case of ETA, in other cases, they do engage in dialogue. So why not do it sooner rather than later? Point 1. Point 2. Let me say that in order to emphasize the necessity of dialogue, it's useful to remember that direct action has already taken place throughout Pakistan with direct reference to the Taliban. But this has not stopped the activities of the TTP. Indeed, while military engagements in Swat Valley in 2011 and on Lal Masjid in Islamabad and in other places have been successful in driving the TTP out, the greater problem remains in the rest of the country. I was in Pakistan last year for 6 months over my sabbatical. At the end of my sabbatical, we visited the northern areas, Nanga Parbat, and 2 weeks after my family and I had gone hiking, Of course, there was the event of the killing of 11 foreign hikers. The Taliban remain, despite the direct actions in Swat Valley. So direct action has already been tried, and it's failed to bring about the desired results. Need I remind us that direct action has already also failed? It has been attempted and failed when Baytullah Masood was killed, the former leader of the TTP. Hakimullah Masood, on the eve of negotiations and dialogue, was killed in a drone attack. Has that brought an end to the Taliban attacks, terrorist attacks? Has that brought a reduced number of people who are willing to join the Taliban? Clearly, there are vested interests, both internally and externally, that do not want dialogue to be given a chance. When, on the eve of negotiations and dialogue, the leader of the Pakistani Taliban was killed in a direct drone attack, you know that there are vested interests who do not want dialogue to take place, because they want destabilization of the region. Lastly, how different is the situation between the Pakistani Taliban and that of the IRA in Northern Ireland, or the ETA separatists in the Basque region of Spain? On the surface, the cases seem to be somewhat different. But remember, the IRA and ETA were also searching for independence for their respective groups and for recognition by governments. Now you may say, okay, the Pakistani Taliban have a semi-autonomous region, the FATA region. But if we probe deeper, we see that in all three cases, the turn to terrorism is never the first course of action for militant groups. Indeed, the IRA and ETA each turned to violence only after repeated attempts at recognition were denied. I would say the same for the Taliban. Now, in the case of IRA, after decades of denying legitimacy and recognition to the IRA, because of the usual refrain, we don't deal with terrorists. We don't want to give legitimacy to terrorist actions. In the end, the British government did recognize the political wing of the IRA, the political wing being Sinn Féin. It was the only way to end the troubles in Northern Ireland. Negotiations were not easy, but the hardest thing is to first recognize the other as having a right to be heard, and then to recognize the necessity of dialogue. That is the biggest obstacle. Did the IRA not target government institutions? Did the IRA not kill civilians in the process, including children? It's sometimes argued that the Taliban are religious fundamentalists and hence are irrational and literalist and cannot be trusted. But like the Taliban, wasn't there a religious difference that motivated the IRA as opposed to the British government? The IRA, Catholics, British government, Protestant, fighting loyalist, Catholic and Protestants, fighting one another. Why is the Taliban regarded as more irrational and not able to come to dialogue than other militant groups? The only reason to call such groups militant and irrational is that these are the usual tactics of governments that don't want to give legitimacy and recognition to their opponents. The IRA wasn't quashed by direct action, but was eliminated by recognizing and legitimizing it. Similarly, the case of the Basque separatists in Spain. They engaged in terrorist activities, but agreed just this past fall to lay down their arms and to stop their militant activities. They are now engaging in negotiations with the government in Madrid, with the Spanish government. And just today I saw a headline that they're negotiating to have 150 members of their organization who have been jailed in Spain and in France. They're negotiating to have these members released. Spain is negotiating with them. Will Pakistan not do the same? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaidi. Now I'd like to call upon Saad Imtiaz to open the debate on his side of the house. Thank you.
We've all gathered here today to discuss this very important issue, Taliban. Just the word itself conjures up so many images in our mind, perhaps images of death, destruction, fear, etc. We all gather to raise our point of views, our opinions, use our intellect to propose solutions, heavy, serious solutions to this problem. In fact, all of Pakistan is doing this. The politicians all have their own line of action. Each one of them quibbles and proposes their own point of views on how to solve this problem. Months go by with no clear solution emerging. The news channels of Pakistan, which for the record have become what Bollywood is to India, entertainment, a distraction. All these news channels analyze this problem all the time, each day, every day. In fact, they analyze it from so many different angles, so many different perspectives, each time arriving at a different conclusion, that by the end, the viewer himself is confused. Perhaps deep down in our hearts, we believe that we will propose the solution, the magic solution which will result in proof, and Taliban will vanish from this earth, and all of us will live happily ever after in eternal bliss. This is a serious problem, though. I feel we're all going about this problem in a wrong way. In fact, I feel we're all going about this problem in the opposite way. We're all using our minds to treat this Taliban problem as a separate entity, projecting our intellect, our belief system on this problem. We believe Taliban to be a separate entity, perhaps an alien from Mars who are savages with no connection to the human race. But aren't the Taliban really that different from us? Isn't this at its core a human problem? If this is a human problem, and since all of us happen to be humans, shouldn't we first look at ourselves, at the human mind? I feel we need to go microscoping instead of going outwards, and see it as a problem of the mind instead of going all guns blazing and pointing it at the Taliban. So please allow me to start very near, very close. This problem seems to be a problem of conflict. Would you all agree to that? Isn't this a conflict? At its core, what is the reason for human conflict? We see conflict every day in our lives. Conflict between parents, conflict between siblings, conflict between spouses. You should check out the cricket games in Waterloo. If you saw us there, you might mistake us for Taliban. So at its core, what is the root of conflict? Isn't conflict simply a clash of two opposing viewpoints? I'm attached to one belief, and you're attached to another. Since the beliefs are opposites, we collide. Haven't you ever sat on a dining table, peacefully eating when the discussion starts innocently, and then within a second it turns into something really big, an argument which doesn't stop? Isn't Taliban just a magnification of the individual human problem on a much larger scale? A group of people seem to be very strongly, attached to some ideas about how life should be lived, from the working of government right down to the prohibition of genes for women. Strong attachment. So how are we to solve this problem? The Taliban. I feel that instead of finding the solution, let's start by negating the obvious actions which cannot be solutions. Actions which perhaps only perpetuate the problem instead of solving it. Should we fight the Taliban? Should our armies rise in arms against them? You adhere to one point of view, and I adhere to a strictly opposite viewpoint, and we both will battle it out to solve the problem. Has conflict ever been solved this way? World War I was such conflict between two opposing sides. The total death count was approximately 37 million. The Taliban are also a result of an earlier conflict. The Russian invasion in Afghanistan in 1979 resulted in America funding jihadis from all over the world, having them fly into Pakistan. This is the aftermath of that. Pick an example out of your own life. Have you ever fought with your father, sibling, your partner? I'm sure you have, unless you're all with us, which I'm assuming you're not. What happens to the fight when you strongly stick to your viewpoint and the other to theirs? Does the fight ever stop? Doesn't it keep escalating until one party decides to either be non-reactive or just let it go? If you decide to go in arms against the Taliban, the fact is that they're ready to die for their belief, which you are not. They aren't going to go quite like your father, like your sibling, or your partner. So the only solution in conflict would be for us to annihilate the whole Taliban. Do you know what that means? Kill each and every Taliban, each and every person who adheres to this belief, this viewpoint, so that this ideology is wiped off the face of this earth. And of course, in the process of this conflict, if you do manage this really amazing feat, there will be deep destruction, countless innocent lives lost, lots of misery, etc. Conflict through military action will only exaggerate the problem. USA has been in the region for over 12 years. Look at what they have achieved. Can we really achieve what their army couldn't? No. So conflict is not the answer. This brings us to another way of tackling the Taliban, which is analysis, which all of Pakistan is obsessed with. Is peace to be found through analysis? This is what every news channel in Pakistan is doing at the moment. Approaching the problem from one angle, then from another, gathering all the points, and then reaching a conclusion. This analysis does not stop in news channels, it carries over to our drawing rooms. We all come to sit and analyze the problem, but I think first we need to know what is analysis. Analysis that I take a problem, and by the use of my logic, I use data from the world, and then I reach a certain conclusion. This is the problem, these are the facts about it, and this is the conclusion that I reach. All analysis will be different because all analysis will have different data, different viewpoints, and thus different conclusions. For example, there's a cricket game between us, you abused me yesterday, that's the data, I don't like you, so the conclusion is today I want to beat you. I really do want to beat you. Or hold on, I just heard today that your friend also called me stupid behind my back, new data has come to light, so now I want to beat your friend as well. Can you notice something here? If I keep analyzing, I will never reach a conclusion. Until I'm analyzing, I'm trying to find a solution, so at the moment, there is no solution. We are all here today still analyzing, which means we are all trying to find a solution. So technically, until this debate contest finishes, we have no solution because we're still analyzing the problem. So let's not overanalyze this problem. All the news channels are part of the problem because they all sit in their room, lazily arguing, quibbling over what is the best solution to the problem. The problem then spreads to the drawing room, and here we all are entertaining ourselves over dinner with this problem. Every news channel you see, it starts with आज हम फिर ये problem discuss करेंगे तालिबान की, हम ये problem 3000 दफा पहले फिर भी discuss कर चुके हैं, पर आज हम फिर भी करेंगे क्योंकि हम bored हैं. So analysis is not the answer to the problem. Analysis is actually paralysis. We've been stuck with this problem for over 10 years, and we still keep talking about it. If there's one thing the Taliban are better than us, they don't analyze. They've decided their course of action. Why waste time in analyzing? Prepare the bomb, decide the place, paradise, here I come, boom. So what is the solution to this problem? Fighting against them perpetuates the problem. It results in death and misery on both accounts. Analyzing it leads to paralysis, no action, more misery. What exactly is the solution to this problem? There are some surface solutions that we can't use. The government needs to use all of its resources in protecting the safety of the citizens, rather than debating endlessly. Peace talks are the best option for now since they halt the violence, but they won't work long term. Because if the Taliban doesn't budge on its ideology, there will come a time when they will attack again. Peace talks have been happening between Palestine and Israel for some time. It goes on for some time. A war erupts again. It's right now happening in Syria. It's been happening in Iraq. The solution has never been permanent. So we're left with the problem again. What is the solution? You're probably not going to like what I'm going to say next. Have you ever been in a room? Have you ever been in a room with friends where one of your friends tries to put you down? Makes fun of your clothes perhaps, or insult you? Have you? What do? If you have a quick wit, you can get back at him and insult him. Maybe get back at him, put him down. Something that stings, something that hurts, that puts him down in front of everyone. Either the person will retort back, which starts a perpetual conflict which never ends, or he will go quiet. But he probably won't forget the insult even if he does go quiet. It will register. Somewhere, somehow, that grudge will manifest. I say this because at its core, this is the same conflict as the Taliban conflict, one party with a mindset trying to overpower another party with a different mindset. So let's forget Taliban, look at this problem personally. The mind works the same way. Find a solution to this yourself, and the collective manifestation may be the solution. What happens when you become completely non-confrontational? What happens? See what happens next time someone insults you. Don't register it. See how quick the conflict ends. Don't try to get back. Don't feel insulted. The other person is a sick man caught in the web of his own mind. Be completely non-reactive. See what happens next. I would like to ask you a question. Why are we all so desperate to change the world when all of our lives are full of problems? Why are we all so keen to purify the world when most of us are impure ourselves? Are all of us peaceful? Do all of us have our angers in our control? Is our world a peaceful place? Do we all never think ill about a person? Are we all not desperate to impose our viewpoint on others? Our thinking, our mind, isn't it so important to all of us? All of Pakistan's out to solve the Taliban violence, when there's violence in all of our lives. We are all out to solve the Taliban physical attacks while we ourselves verbally attack others. Is verbal attack actually that different from physical attack? Isn't an insult the first step of violence? My viewpoint is that they're on the pedestal, your viewpoint is swimming in the gutter. Isn't a violent person's world a violent one while a peaceful person's world is a peaceful one? So what then is the root cause of violence conflict? Think it through, it's harder and more subtle than this intellectual game we're playing. What is the way to bring peace in our lives so that our world becomes peaceful? What stops us from experiencing a peaceful world? Isn't it addiction to thinking? Aren't we all lost in our own minds? Our ambitions, our desire to be great, our desire to fulfill ourselves, our desire to shine, our desire to stand up. Tell me if your mind wants to stand out amongst the crowd and my mind also seeks to stand out amongst the crowd, are we not in conflict with each other? Isn't this addiction to self-enhancement, self-fulfillment, which is simply self-serving thinking, the reason for all this conflict in the world? A Maulvi in Peshawar gets angry if someone else spots the chand and declares Eid. And if a person in Peshawar gets angry if someone else sits on his own chair. Each individual in Pakistan here in this room needs to change himself or herself before we think about changing the world, because we are the world, and if we can do that, the lack of conflict in us might result in the whole world changing. So can you as a person change yourself? Find peace that is not shaped by someone else, even if it kills you, but you're not going to like the solution, because the solution does not point at the world, it points at you. It asks you to change yourself, and that is not easy. You want a definite result, a conclusion that you follow, and this doesn't give you that, so you reject it. And revert back to conflict analysis and all other subtle ways of thinking. And maybe that's why we still don't have peace in the world. Thank you, and sorry.
Thank you. All right, now I'd like to call upon Zafar and Bangash to continue the debate on his side of the house. Here.
Before I start, I'd like to, as in the introduction, Malala's name was mentioned. I'd like to know how many of you know Malala. Please raise your hands. Good. Okay. I'd like to ask you how many of you have heard of the name Nabila? Okay, 1, 2, 3. So obviously, the overwhelming majority have heard of Malala, but hardly anybody has heard of Nabila. And let me start off by these two girls. Malala was attacked in Swat by the Taliban on October the 8th of 2011 or 12. It was 2012. Nabila was in North Waziristan in a small village just outside Miranshah, a city in North Waziristan, where 2 Hellfire missiles were fired at near their house, where her 68-year-old grandmother was picking vegetables for that evening's dinner, and they were about to celebrate Eid al-Adha the next day. That 68-year-old grandmother was instantly killed, her body blown to pieces by an American, or 2 Hellfire missiles fired by an American drone. Nabila was badly injured. Her 2 brothers were badly injured. Of course, it was a terrible experience for them, but the father had an even more difficult choice to make. And the choice that he had to make was, he was so poor that he could treat only one of his children. It was either going to be Nabila or one of her 2 brothers, a 13-year-old brother or a 3-year-old brother, who had multiple injuries. His ribs were broken, his leg was broken, his arms were broken by the missiles that were fired. So the father decided that he was going to treat only one child, and that was the 13-year-old. Not Nabila, not the youngest child, but only a 13-year-old, because he was so poor, he felt that this 13-year-old boy is going to solve or help me to earn a decent living. Now Nabila, her father, and her 2 siblings came to Washington, D.C. last year, brought by an American senator or a congressman from Florida, to talk about their plight. And to this day, America has not recognized the crime that it has committed. Why I start with this story is the following. We all know about 9/11. We all know that America accused 19 people of flying planes, etc., into the World Trade Center and so on. I won't go into the reasons, the arguments, or who was responsible or who was not. I just want to bring to your attention that, that there wasn't a single Afghan who was accused of participating in 9/11. The Americans said that there were 15 Saudis. I would have thought they would have been far more justified in going after these criminals in Riyadh, these barbarians, these Wahhabi barbarians of Saudi Arabia, rather than killing those poor people in Afghanistan. How many hundreds of thousands of people they've killed? And what has happened? They've brought this war into Pakistan as well now. It was mentioned in the beginning that the Tehrik-e-Taliban appeared in 2007. And you know how they appeared. They emerged when General Musharraf attacked the Lal Masjid in Islamabad, even though the people in the Lal Masjid, although I have no sympathy with them, I don't subscribe to their ideology, they had accepted each and every one of the conditions that Musharraf had put forward to them. And yet, under American pressure, he attacked the Lal Masjid, he slaughtered hundreds of innocent girls, many of them from Swat Valley. And that's how the Tehrik-e-Taliban emerged. But the Pakistan army has been attacking these tribal people in Waziristan since long before 2007. In fact, the first attacks carried out by the Pakistan army were in 2004, in March of 2004. In fact, soon after that, there was even an agreement with the Taliban, a peace agreement. A Pakistani general went and he actually exchanged garlands and copies of the Quran with one of the leaders of the Taliban, or one of the tribal leaders by the name of Naik Muhammad. And a few days later, Naik Muhammad is blown to pieces. Now I can tell you, if you put your hand in a hornet's nest, which is the tribal people in Pakistan, you are looking for trouble. Prior to 2004, the western border of Pakistan was secure. Now you have insecurity over there. Pakistan used to worry about its problems on the eastern border with India. Now it is engulfed in a war on the western border as well. I want to mention one other thing to you about the Taliban. You know, everybody keeps on throwing this word, the Taliban, Taliban. It has become a generic word, just like Al-Qaeda. Everybody is Al-Qaeda. Anybody who blows a bomb somewhere becomes Al-Qaeda. Now it has become the Taliban. It is a very convenient label that people throw about without understanding the issue. I'm not a supporter of the Taliban, but I still believe that under the name and the guise of the word Taliban, a lot of criminal elements have put on the garb of the Taliban and indulging in all kinds of activities. Let me give you my own personal life or my family experience. My own uncle was kidnapped 2 years ago by quote-unquote Taliban, and he was murdered. And, you know, of course, he went to the police and they said, oh, if you find out who did it, let us know. Okay? I have several relatives still that have been kidnapped and people are asking for ransom money. We live in an area, I think the place has become notorious now, the place is called Hangu. It's a very notorious area now because there are so many attacks and bombing explosions taking place over there. We have personal problems with this, but we know that these are not necessarily Taliban. These are criminal elements. And the tragedy is that in Pakistan, those who advocate that the Pakistani army should go after the Taliban, well, it's the Pakistan army that is nurturing the Taliban, for God's sake. So what is it going to do with those Taliban? They are the ones that are keeping these Taliban. They were the ones who had been financing these other groups prior to that, whether it was Lashkar-e-Jangvi or Lashkar-e-Tayyiba or all of these other groups. So we are being fooled by the people in Pakistan, the rulers. You know, there is talk about, you know, these rulers in Pakistan doing something about the problem. You go and find out the manner in which these people live, whether it's the current government or the previous government. They live in palatial palaces. They steal everything that they can get their grubby hands on. And the ordinary people are left to fend for themselves. We are being made to fight amongst ourselves when these criminals sitting in their palaces are enjoying their lives. This is the problem that Pakistan faces. Taliban are not the problem. And I think if we want to get to the root of the problem, we have to understand that this problem can only be solved through negotiations. Let me give you just two quick examples. Professor Zaidi had mentioned the IRA and ETA, etc. In South Africa, after the apartheid ended, the black South Africans, the ANC, could have embarked on a process of revenge killings. But they didn't. They went for truth and reconciliation. That's why South Africa was saved the ravages of a war. What is our objective? Is it to seek revenge, or is it to solve the problem for the people of Pakistan? And of course for many other areas. Unless and until we are consumed by some kind of a notion that only military might is going to solve our problems, I think if we go down the route of dialogue, it has a far better chance of success rather than taking the sledgehammer to a problem that is their own creation. And let me conclude with this. I know most of you probably were not even born in 1971, but I was a young student in England, and I went through that bitter experience of the breakup of Pakistan into Bangladesh. Now, if the political leadership in Pakistan had had the sense to sit down with the political leadership of former East Pakistan, there would have been no Bangladesh. So what did they do? Send the army, kill these Bengalis, they are inferior to us, etc. What was the net result? Not only the breakup of Pakistan, but 90,000 Pakistani soldiers had to go through the humiliation of surrendering to the invading Indian army. Go to Balochistan. What are they doing in Balochistan? They don't tell you much about it, but since 1973, there has been an insurrection going on in Balochistan. In fact, the net result is, and the army is involved over there, there are hundreds of thousands of people that have simply disappeared, that the Balochistan government in exile is today set up in Tel Aviv. Now you open an opportunity for your own enemies to interfere in your affairs when you indulge in these kinds of nonsensical attitudes and behavior. So that if you want to save Pakistan and if you really care about Pakistan, then you have to address the issue in a proper way. The sledgehammer is not the solution to these problems. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zafar Bangash. No, I know. I just didn't know if I think you're a professor, right? Yeah, I apologize. I just didn't know beforehand. All right, now I'd like to call upon Junaid Malik to give his opening statement.
Okay. So, my stance, to reiterate, is that dialogue right now is going to be ineffective and, in turn, detrimental to Pakistan's situation. Right now, what we have is an external force. I will call the Taliban an external force because of the support that they're getting from all these different nations, including India, Saudi Arabia, the States, and, of course, Iran. The Taliban are a different mindset of people than the moderate Pakistanis. Pakistan is a moderate nation founded on non-extremist values. We are not an extremist nation that wants to implement a twisted version of the Sharia law that these Taliban claim that is true Islam. It's not. They want a Sharia law where women and little girls can't go to school. You leave your women inside the houses. They have to be covered up at all times. It's an oppressive system, and Pakistanis do not stand for that. My point is that these people have come to the table, come to the negotiation tables as they have been going on recently, come to the negotiation tables with guns. We need to disarm them. We need to bring them to the table on our terms. If they come here on their terms, and one of the main, in their 14-point agenda that they had, one of the main points was the implementation of Sharia law, I don't stand for this. I belong to a Pakistan that supports its women. I belong to a Pakistan that's moderate. I belong to a Pakistan that's sovereign. If there is any talk that needs to happen, any sort of negotiations that need to happen, they need to happen amongst our neighbors. We need to talk to India. We need to talk to China. We need to talk to Iran and the Afghani government at this point. Take out the Saudi influence from the country. Take out the American influence from the country. If there is intelligence that we can use from them, use them. But we need to be the ones that handle the situation ourselves. The problem is these external factors. The Taliban in their setups, I don't want to dub them all Taliban in the Fatah region and everything, which is the federally administered tribal area northwest of Pakistan. I don't want to dub them all Taliban, but they do belong to a different culture. Their jirgas and everything work because all of those people, that small population of people, believe that that is the way to go. But our communities do not believe in that. Our communities go and watch movies. We are a solid, moderate nation that is educated. We want to focus on education. In the past, there has been military action, as you guys probably know of the Saad Valley operation. The direct action succeeded. It was the aftermath that failed. It was the social economic, it was the lack of social economic backup that failed, that called for more people to come in and fill in that social economic vacuum. Military action or direct action works in eradicating the problem right there and then, but it needs to get backed up by policies, by social work. People need to walk in there and build. People need to walk in there and educate. The Taliban run out of madrasas. What is a madrasa? A madrasa is a school. We need to educate our population in a way that produces a good generation, a generation that's empathetic to each other, that is not so strict, that is not so nationalist. We are, at this point, everyone is going at each other to bring each other down because life is just too damn hard. My point being, the definition of negotiation is a give or take. I will not compromise on my constitution. That is the point. We will not compromise on our constitution because the Sharia law that these guys proclaim is true Islam is false. March 1st, 2014, Pakistani Taliban announced 1 month ceasefire to aid peace talks. This news came out after the Pakistani Taliban accepted that they slaughtered 23 paramilitary personnel. If they want to impose Sharia law, they should figure out how prisoners are treated in Sharia law to begin with. Another point that I wanted to make was that the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is one group. Then you have the Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, then you have the Al-Qaeda. There is quite a lot of groups that are taking up arms against the government, and they want their rule of law. Even if the negotiations go through, the TTP is an umbrella organization which has 13 other terrorist organizations under it. Can we be assured that if the leader of the TTP at this point agrees to something, that the 13 will not just disperse, start attacking, start making up their own ideology that they need to push through? What we need to do is besiege them. We need to kill their external contacts. We need to keep them starved out of ammunition and resources to bring them to the table. We will not, I do not want to compromise on the Constitution. That isn't perfect, but we still need work on it. But I'm not willing to take their word for what my Constitution should be. What's required is direct, strategic military action backed up by social economic movements that will pull these kids that have been brainwashed, that have been pushed into this militarization of the whole notion. They've made them desperate enough to believe that this is the only way. We need military action backed up by social economic programs that will pull these poor souls out of this. Yeah, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Junaid, Malik. All right. Now the next 7.5 minutes each is supposed to be dedicated to refutation, right? Now, I don't. Now, the structure of how this refutation is, I think, should be up to each of your speakers in the sense that if you want to create a constructive speech about the potential pitfalls of any of the opposition arguments, and that's completely up to you to do. Whereas if you want to have some direct questions that you may want answered, then that's also acceptable if you would like so. And okay, so without further ado, I would like to call upon Professor Ali Zaidi to begin his 7.5 speech on refutation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Won't be 7.5 minutes, but do what I can. Let me begin first by saying something that Junaid brought up right at the beginning. He said, look, the civilian faith in the Pakistani government is eroding because they're not dealing with the Taliban situation. Now, I haven't lived in Pakistan much of my life. I spent years in the 80s and in the 70s and recently. And I know that the civilian faith in the Pakistani government is eroded long before the Taliban ever came into being. The civilian faith is eroding because the government cannot provide electricity or gas or security from other kinds of violence, not just the violence of the Taliban. So that's one. Since our friend Saad didn't give us the kind of opposition that we would have wanted from that position, let me say something from their point of view and then counteract that. Okay? So in my introductory comments, in my construction of the argument, I said there's two cases where dialogue has worked, IRA and ETA. There is one case in very contemporary recent history where direct action was effective. And that is of the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, the LTTE. Okay? The Sinhalese government in Sri Lanka essentially wiped out the LTTE. You guys in University of Waterloo know this better than I. One of your students here was implicated in the LTTE. Right? The Sinhalese government used dialogue and negotiation as a stalling tactic. They weakened the LTTE and eventually, over a long period of time, wiped them out. And so, yes, in that case, direct action worked. But there are important differences between the LTTE and the case of the TTP. One, the LTTE was always such an extremist organization that it had alienated Tamil Hindus, let alone Sinhalese Buddhists. It had alienated its own constituency from the early 1980s. I was a high school student in Scarborough, and there were Tamil Hindus who had fled Tamil Eelam, the greater Tamil area, because the LTTE had essentially forcibly taken over their houses and were using them as bases. In a way that the Taliban has not alienated its own constituency in that same way. There is a difference. Another important difference is that the LTTE did not have sympathizers within the state or enablers within the state. It is not clear, I'll explain what I mean. It is not clear against whom you would do direct action. You talk about getting rid of external forces that are supporting the Taliban. Suppose that, like the Sinhalese government, you wipe out the Taliban. Right? You dialogue, you negotiate, you stall, and then you wipe them out. What about the sympathizers and the enablers that exist within the Pakistani military and the ISI and within Pakistani administration itself, the state? Are you going to do direct action against yourselves? Who actually, because of their activities, brought about the rise of the Afghani Taliban in the 1980s in the fight against the Soviet Union? We know the ISI was behind it. We know that the Pakistani government supported Mujahideen, which eventually gave rise to the Taliban in Afghanistan and now in Pakistan. Are you going to do direct action against yourselves? Who exactly are you going to act against? A couple more short points. As I mentioned at the beginning, governments always negotiate, except for the case of Sri Lanka. Even the US in the 1980s against this arch enemy, Iran, they said, we will never negotiate under Ronald Reagan. Meanwhile, under the table, they were negotiating and sending arms you know, the Iran-Contra affair. There's always negotiations, there's dialogue. Why not make it sooner rather than later? Why not do it over the table rather than under the table? Right? Direct action only leads to further reprisals. We know the saying, an eye for an eye. It's a biblical reference. Islam is less of a pacifist orientation, perhaps, though even in Islam we have Sufi orientations. Direct action leads to further reprisals, but especially when you're dealing with the Pakhtun population, who have long memories, whose customs and cultures are rooted in generation after generation of seeking revenge. Direct action, when it comes to the Pakhtun, is an ineffective means of resolving the situation, especially against the Pakhtun. Now, lastly, I can understand the appeal of direct action. It appeals to our sense of urgency. Right? Junaid was saying, we have this urgency to act. We have to do something. This is, after all, why we are here. This debate has been framed. We need to do something. We have to do anything. But we have to do it now. This short-term mentality is itself destructive. There are deeper problems in our thinking. This short-term mentality and direct action is destructive not only in the long term, because it breeds further acts of reprisal and revenge, but it is destructive even in the short term, because it gives us a false sense of security, and it gives us a false sense of justice. We think we have wiped out the evildoers. Who are the evildoers? As I said at the beginning, terror is committed not only by subnational actors, but by states as well. And finally, this kind of mentality assumes that the other is not capable of dialogue. Junaid said as much. He said these are fanatical, radical extremists who have a completely different mindset. Almost he was saying that they're not human, you can't dialogue with them. This is the destruction of this kind of direct action in the short term. It dehumanizes the other. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zaidi. And I'd like to call upon Saad Imtiaz.
I actually don't have much of a conflict or rebuttals on this, but I'll try. There are 1 or 2 points that I would like to make. One was there was mention about vested interest, about how there are a lot of vested interest in Pakistan, which might be one reason for us not solving this problem. I would disagree, because I think we also have a lot of vested interest in other countries. For example, I would be very surprised if Pakistan doesn't have a vested interest in some level in the destabilization of India. But still, we do. I think India is still doing much better than us. So I think there are a lot of our own problems apart from just vested interest, which are the reason for Taliban still existing, and our own problems. So I think destabilization of Pakistan, even if there are vested interest, the issues run much deeper and closer to home than vested interest. Apart from that, there is not much. My point of view, unfortunately, does happen to be more closer to peace than it is to war. So I don't think I'd have much more refutations to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Saad. And I'd like to call upon Professor Zafar Bangash. Thank you.
Let me start off by saying that I agree with Junaid when he says that the Constitution of Pakistan should be respected. And I think a good starting point would be for the Prime Minister of Pakistan, the President of Pakistan, the ministers in Pakistan should all follow the Constitution of Pakistan. In fact, it has been admitted that if the Constitution of Pakistan were properly implemented, more than 80% of the members of the National Assembly would be disqualified. So how on earth are these people calling about demanding that the Taliban should follow the constitution of Pakistan when they themselves don't follow it? You know, this is the problem in Pakistan, that, you know, all kinds of demands are being made. You know, let me go on to the other things. You see, Junaid said that the Taliban brutally murdered 23 members of the Frontier Constabulary that they had been holding since 2010 or 11. This is true, and it was a crime that they committed, and it should be condemned. But I think it should be looked in context. They said, while you were talking about preparing the ground for negotiations, during the same period, government forces murdered more than 60 Taliban that they had in their own possession, in prison. So they said, you keep on killing our people, and then you say that we won't take any revenge? This is unfortunately the back and forth that goes on, which poisons the atmosphere. So we need to have a proper understanding of the reality and a fuller picture. You know, I don't wish to only zero in on Junaid, but he's the only one who made some points that, I mean, Saad was agreeing with us, and thank you very much, we really appreciate it. He said that, you know, direct military action succeeded, it was the aftermath that wasn't followed up. You know, it reminds me of a doctor treating a patient and the patient died. He said, well, you know, the treatment was successful, it's just that the patient succumbed. So, if you don't have the aftermath, I mean, you know, this is, in Pakistan, of course, we need to educate our people, but how do we do it? You know, as Professor Zaidi said, if 50% of the budget is used for the military, and you donate and you allocate only 1% or less for education, no wonder you would have these problems in the country. I think we've got all of our priorities wrong. We keep on going for these military solutions, and let me be very honest, I'm afraid the Pakistan army, like every army in the Muslim world, has not won a single battle against their enemies. So why are we giving them billions and billions of dollars? For what? I think we should put these people to work. I would suggest that the Pakistan army should be sent to the deserts of Sindh to till the land so that they could become more productive members of society, rather than taking billions of dollars and living in these palatial homes. And if they're really prepared to fight external wars, then so be it. Then let them come forward. And let's look at the alternative example of Iran. They didn't rely on their army after the revolution. They actually established the Revolutionary Guards. And that is how they defended the revolution. You look at Hezbollah in Lebanon. The Lebanon army has not been able to fire a single shot against the Israelis. It was the Hezbollah that fought against the Israelis and defeated them, not once but several times. How many Arab armies have done that, you know, with their billions of dollars of budgets, their planes and tanks and so on? Armies are not the solution to our problem. They are actually part of the problem. And that's why we need to reorient our priorities. And therefore, going for these gung-ho solutions of sledgehammer and killing people, etc., is not going to work. Negotiations is the only way, and that's why we are advocating that there should be a dialogue. You have a dialogue with your enemies. If you are friends, you don't need to have a dialogue. You're already friends. So I think you need to dialogue with your enemies and then find out whether it works or not. And in fact, one other aspect is that when you dialogue with some of these people, it actually helps you to split your enemy and weaken them. And that's the purpose. You weaken your enemy in order to achieve your objective. So that's why we are in favor of dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bangash. I'd like to call upon Junaid Malik.
All right. This is turning into a bit of sorry? I didn't say that. Okay, so we have a couple of points going back and forth. If we're not sure who we're fighting against, that was the first point, right? So we can't come up with a collective name for all these militant movements. If we're not sure who we're fighting against, then who are we talking to? It has to be something, some organization, someone, some consolidation there that is coming to the table and representing the rest of them. I don't feel like I don't know if we're not comfortable in letting this one person or this one big organization represent all the rest of them in a fight. How are we going to expect them to hold their own or hold their end after a negotiation. That was one point of being able to figure out who we're actually fighting against. And the next point that was brought up was that talks are important and stuff, but I believe that the time for talks was when we funded them against Russia. That's when we should have kept our peace. That's when we should have given them enough backup to fall back and have them not turn on us. The time for talks was through Lal Masjid, as Professor Zafar brought up. The time for talks would have been before we gave the Americans bases against the Taliban in the Afghani war, and that fueled the whole thing spreading north to south. And then now there's this assumption that I don't know. I think the premise is a little different here. What are we questioning? Is the government good? Are we assuming that to begin with? Is the army good, or is the Taliban good? If we don't trust the government and we don't trust the army, then who are we trusting here? Is it just the civilians that we're trusting? Then we should probably be in the streets and fighting, I believe. Next point. Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm trying to get at, is that we need to define the problem here. We're talking about negotiations, that's fine. I'm talking about military action against people that have posed a threat to us. These people are standing at our door with guns, and if we don't defend ourselves right now, we will go to the table on their terms. Till the Taliban come to the table on our terms, I believe negotiations right now are not only ineffective, but they will be detrimental to Pakistan that it is today. Thanks.
Thank you, Junaid. Okay, now it's the same allocation of time for any reconstruction, which is essentially, you know, if there was any points made that you feel were made towards anything that you said in the refutation, then you can reconstruct your point. Again, 7 minutes and a half is a maximum, and you don't need to follow it. And after this reconstruction, then the official debate is done, in which case there will be personal questions and answers from the audience for any points of clarification. And before the personal questions and answers, I'll ask everyone to fill in their report cards for the end of the debate. And so this will be your last 7.5 minutes for your official allocation time. Thank you.
Thank you, Junaid, for your comments and criticisms of our position. I appreciate that. You're asking, what assurance do you have, what assurance does the Pakistani population have that of the 13 factions who might be represented in the Taliban, the others will follow the agreement? What assurance do the Taliban have that after an election, one Pakistani party which wins the next election will follow the agreement of a previous government? What assurance do we have that the constitution that is in place at the time of such an agreement will be in place 5 years or 10 years from now? Pakistan's history does not give me a lot of confidence. Its military history over the last 47, 50 years does not give me a lot of confidence that a new dictator will not come and suddenly revise the constitution according to his own whims and pleasures. So the problem of how do we know, how can we assure agreement applies both to subnational groups as well as national groups. As I've been saying from the beginning, terror is not something that only subnational groups engage in, it is something that states as well engage in. In fact, the dropping of the atomic bomb was an act of terror engaged in by the state. Napalming of a population was an act of terror engaged in by a state. The use of mustard gas against its own civilian population was an act of terror engaged in by a state. We should stop identifying terrorism with only subnational actors and recognize that terrorism is a tactic mostly used by the weak, but also used by the powerful, as I mentioned at the beginning. Now, what is terrorism? terrorism varies, the forms of it vary from time to time, from group to group, but underlying terrorism is essentially the same content or idea, and that is the search for recognition and legitimacy. In the modern context, what do we refer to when we say the terror? Do you know what the terror was? The terror refers to the French revolutionary forces that overthrew the Ancien Regime, the monarchs in France, in order to bring about liberty, equality, and brotherhood. Liberté, égalité, and fraternité. That was the idealistic slogan of the French Revolution, and they engaged in terror. So terrorism has been part of the modern age from the 18th century. It is not anything new. The Taliban do not represent anything new. Their mindset is not different than other mindsets that we have seen in time. This is a problem of recognition, of conveying that the other has a right to be heard. And if you can bring your conditions to the table, and only your conditions will set the framework, then you have already denied the other their humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zaidi, and I'd like to call upon Saad and Imtiaz.
I did have a few questions for our fellow speakers. First one was, what happens if Taliban doesn't budge down from their point of view of the Sharia? How are peace talks going to be helpful then if the point of negotiation is not being agreed upon? The second question I had was, how long do you carry the peace talks without achieving a result? And the third question I had was that in the past, do correct me if I'm wrong on this, Taliban has promised peace, promised a substantial time period of peace, and yet broken that promise on peace talk and attacked in between, if I'm not wrong on this. What is the solution you propose in that case? These are the three questions I have. We can ask direct questions.
Yes,
yeah. Okay. The third question was, in the past, Taliban has promised that there's been a peace agreement, and yet Taliban has broken that peace agreement and attacked in between. What would you suggest be the ideal course of action in that case? These are the three questions I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You can start. I guess I'd like to call upon then Professor Zafar Bangash to close the speech in his side of the house. Thank you.
Let me address, or try to address, what Saad brought up, that the Taliban want to impose a Sharia law. I think this is one of those red herrings that is constantly brought up. You know, I think those of you who are Muslims, you are already practicing Sharia to some extent or another. When you, for instance, eat halal food, that's part of your Sharia. If you pray, that's part of your Sharia. You get married according to Islamic law, that's part of your Sharia. So I don't think that Sharia is something that you should be scared of. We sort of somehow conjure up these images that have been created for us by the West. They keep on, you know, in the US they had a whole campaign, and a number of states had passed laws to say that they will not allow Sharia law in that particular state. But nobody had asked for it, for God's sake. And we are seeing the similar sort of, argument being presented over here. What do the Taliban mean by Sharia law if they want to impose it? They're not imposing it in Islamabad. They're not coming to Islamabad. They want to be left alone in North Waziristan or South Waziristan. And they have lived like that for thousands of years. You know, the Pathans have a 5,000-year history. I know this because I'm a Pathan. And my, ancestors came from North Waziristan. So and I've been there, and I can tell you, I don't like their lifestyle, but they want to be left in their own lifestyle. They're not imposing it on anybody else, number one. Second, how long should the talks continue? Well, as long as it is required to bring about a peaceful resolution. I don't think that the Taliban have been derelict in this respect. It is, in fact, the government side that has always betrayed the other side, not the Taliban as such. With respect to attacks being carried out in between, as I mentioned, back in 2004, an agreement was signed with the tribal leaders of North Waziristan by a Pakistani general. There are documents available. It's not something unknown. They signed a peace treaty, and then a few weeks later they went and bombed the place and killed the very people with whom they had signed the peace treaty. So who is at fault? Was it the Taliban? Was it the tribal people? Or was it these generals intoxicated by their guns and weapons? That's the problem that we have to address. Let me go back to the issue of addressing the question. Pakistan has deployed something like 120,000 troops in the tribal areas of Pakistan at the behest of the United States. An area that was peaceful before that has now become a troubled area full of conflict and all kinds of problems for Pakistan. What was the reason? Why did the Pakistan army have to be deployed over there under pressure from the United States? In fact, this whole problem of terrorism in Pakistan is one that has been imposed upon us by the US. And why are we fighting the US's war in Pakistan? The US is not anybody's friend. The US government and establishment is not even friend of the American people. So how can we accept that they are our friends? Look at the record. Since Pakistan deployed its army in the tribal areas, since drone attacks started in the tribal area in 2004, has the problem of terrorism decreased or increased? If it has increased, that means that this approach is not working. In fact, it has exacerbated the problem. That's why we are saying that has to stop. With respect to, disarming the tribal people and the Taliban, every Pathan is born with a gun in his hand. I mean, I think you are really asking for too much when you expect that you're going to disarm them. Good luck to you if you want to. I don't know if Junaid wants to do that. Please go ahead. You are welcome to it. I can tell you, when I was in Pakistan, in our home, and even today, we had guns, and we still have guns over there. That's how the life is. We had not only guns, we had submachine guns. That's the life over there. So what do you do about it? I mean, you want to change their culture? You say, no, you can't have guns anymore. Well, I'll invite Junaid to come to my house in Pakistan. Okay, but finally, or two points. Number one, as I said right at the beginning, if the objective is to solve the problem, then we have to consider all options. And let me leave you with this. Those of us who are Muslims, for us, the example is that of the Prophet ﷺ. What did he do with his enemies? Did he simply take the sword and chop their heads off? Or did he forgive them? He negotiated with them. I invite all of you to get a copy of my book. That's actually, I don't want to do a publicity for my own book, but Alhamdulillah, it has been well received internationally. It has been translated into Farsi, it's been translated into Turkish, into Arabic, and Russian, because people found something interesting, something new that was being discussed in that. That was the Prophet's approach to solving problems. And it was not always with guns and swords, etc. It was through negotiations, through reconciliation, through recognizing the other side. You remember the Prophet's magnanimous gesture at the time of the liberation of Makkah. He could have had all of the tribal leaders of Makkah executed because they had tortured and humiliated the Muslims and driven them out of there. What did he do? He just told them, this day I say to you what Yusuf ﷺ said to his brothers. There is no blame on you. I forgive you. And he won their hearts. That's how we have to approach these problems. Whether it's the Taliban or the tribal areas, etc., they're all part of the Pakistani society. You may not like their lifestyle, but that does not mean that it gives you the right to impose your lifestyle on them. They have lived like that for 5,000 years. Pakistan came into existence only 65 years ago. I think we need to be a little bit more realistic and a little bit more modest in understanding what is going on over here. And not assume that we have all the solutions and nobody else has any dignity or respect. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. I'd like to call upon Junaid Malik to close the debate on his side of the house. Thank you. Here we go. All right. One at a time. Let me clarify. I am not a murderer. Just putting it out there. Just, Right? Please, and now can I please take you up on that offer to go to your house? I would love to.
I would want people to live and let live, by all means. When I mention disarmament, when we want to disarm these people to bring them to the table, I'm not talking about changing their culture. Their 5,000-year-old culture is sacred to them as ours is to us. I'm not talking about changing their culture, I'm talking about their point of view, their view towards us, their perspective towards us. That needs to change. Again, I will bring back the point of not trusting the government, not trusting the army, and not trusting the Taliban. Then where does this discussion lie? We really need to find a core that we can stand on so that we can discuss a definite solution to this problem. Again, this is not a debate. This is most definitely a discussion. Maybe I shouldn't be making these noises in the mic, but forgive me. The Taliban have been given their chance to govern. And this is a weird way to put it, but when they did take the Saad Valley, we did see what happened. We saw the oppression, we saw the terror. Now I'm going to use the word terror for the Taliban because it was terrorizing. It was, it made people scared. They didn't know how to deal with these people that were dragging women out into the streets, flogging them, and then hanging them publicly. The Taliban have played their hand at governing. We are not letting them come into government. The negotiation here has to be from the Pakistani government holding on to its constitution, Pakistani government following its own constitution for one, and then sticking to it, bringing the Taliban onto the table without guns. I don't want to fight, but if they are pointing a gun at me, then I will defend myself. This negotiation, by definition means it's a give or take, and if their demands and if we don't want to compromise on their demands, then there's practically no other option but to hold them down somehow. A military action, I will reiterate my point again, a military action is very necessary. We need strategic and swift action backed up by socioeconomic programs that will bring to the surface the normal problems what these civilians have. It's the civilians that we are concerned about. I don't care if we don't trust the army anymore, but that is our tool at this point. We need to make sure that these civilians have a good life. They are Pakistani, or they were Pakistani to begin with before they rebelled against this government. If the Taliban want to stay in their areas, they can, but they do need to abide by the Constitution of Pakistan, because we are a sovereign nation, and it's about time that Pakistan made sure that everyone knew that it was a sovereign nation. We have an image to maintain outside in the outer world. Pakistan was a moderate nation, a nation where terrorism was huge back in the day. I was probably not even alive when this happened, but these days everyone considers us to be backstabbers, considers us to be terrorists. That is the label. We need to fight that. We need to stand up and tell everyone that we are different than the people that are pushing forward this barbaric rule. I want to make the point that the Pakistani civilization, the Pakistani society, we were based on moderate values. I don't know if that sounds right, but we were based on non-extremist values, and I want to maintain that. That I will not compromise on. Thank you.
Thank you, Junaid, Malik. All right, now there's going to be somebody else. I forgot. Yeah, that will be organizing the questions and answers. But before that, I would ask each of you to fill in the second half of the papers that you fill in the first half in the beginning of the debate as to your personal stance, and then somebody will be collecting them. Okay. All right, behind you, there will be two collectors, and here's the microphone.
Hi, everybody. So I will be moderating this part of the session or the debate, which is a discussion question and answer. So if anybody has any questions while you're filling out your ballots, I'm going to come. Okay, actually, I'm going to get you all to put your answers down and have them collected before we start. Okay, so because the mic doesn't go far enough, I'm going to ask everybody to kind of come up, and we can like form like a line over here and have your questions answered. And if you guys could direct your questions to who you want. Okay.
I'd like to ask Zaidi sir to counter Junaid Malik's last 2 points that he made was that if you can't trust the Pakistani army, you can't trust the government, you can't trust the Taliban, then who you trust? That's the first point. The second point was that if the Taliban has governed in Swat in the past, and that didn't work pretty well, then how do you expect them to come into government?
The first point is fundamental, question of trust. It's absolutely fundamental to having long-term peace. But how do you establish trust? How does trust come about? It takes a long period of time. It requires stability and it requires security. Direct action, military action will not give you that kind of stability and security that you need over a long period of time in order to establish trust with one another. And even when you do establish trust between negotiating parties, the IRA and the British government, for example, they don't trust each other at the beginning of negotiations. You can't say, we trust you and then we will enter into negotiations. You enter into negotiations so that you can trust one another. Trust is not a prerequisite, it is the outcome of dialogue and negotiations. So this is backward. To expect that you will trust a party before you enter into negotiations is to undermine the negotiations. Okay? And it requires a lot of time. The second point about governance, yeah, I mean, of course, if I step out of my mold for a minute, I have to agree with you. It was scary. It is scary. No doubt about it. No. But for the sake of the debate, let me pursue this. For governance, you cannot judge according to 1 year or 2 years. Right? A historian once said, a historian was asked, what do you think about the French Revolution? What do you think about the effects of the French Revolution? And he said, well, I don't know, it's been such a short time, it's only been 200 years. The point is, in order to reflect and analyze and to pass judgment, you need time. 2011, 2010, for a short period of time, and you want to pass judgment on governance? You want to pass judgment of the governance in Afghanistan by the Taliban? When they were trying to establish a form of law and order that the Afghani warlords were not able to establish? If you want to pass judgment, do it over a long period of time. You can't do it over a short period of time. Governance, to judge the Taliban based on their governance in Swat is not fair.
Thank you very much. Very wonderful debate, very lively debate. I have a question for Dr. Zafar Bangash. You made a very profound statement at the end, and that was that the guidance to the solution can be found in the seerah of the Prophet. And I think any Muslim, whether practicing or not practicing, will agree that at the end it is the personality and the life of the Prophet which gives us guidance. But I have a point, I have a question which I want your comment on is, yes, the Prophet did engage in negotiations and writing treaties, but at the end, when that did not work out, he did collect a 10,000 army and marched to Mecca. And he surrounded them. He didn't kill anybody, but he did take a force and essentially brought them down on their knees, and that was the point when he forgave them. So I think that point plays a bit towards Junaid. Would you make a comment on that?
Yes, you are absolutely right. But you need to keep in mind that it was the Meccan mushriks who broke the terms of the treaty. The Prophet ﷺ did not break the treaty. He upheld that treaty. And when they broke the treaty, which was, of course, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, and it had clearly stipulated that there would be peace between the parties for a period of 10 years. Now, when the Meccan mushriks broke the treaty, then the Prophet ﷺ was left with no option. But in fact, even at that time, when Abu Sufyan came to Makkah to try to talk to the Prophet ﷺ, he refused to talk to Abu Sufyan. Instead, the Prophet ﷺ had sent 3 conditions to the Meccan mushriks. He said, one of your allied parties has broken the terms of the treaty. So what you should be doing is you should punish that party for breaking the treaty. Number 1. If you want to do that, number 2, you withdraw your support from that party and let us handle with that party. If you don't accept that, then the third option is that we would be left with no choice but to deal with it ourselves on our terms. And of course, the Meccan mushriks, in their arrogance, rejected all the 2 conditions and said, okay, you can do what you like. And that is when the Prophet ﷺ marched on Makkah with 10,000 army. As I said in my submission, the Prophet would have been perfectly justified in not only killing those people who had broken the treaty, but also arresting and executing all of the Meccan leaders, because they had for 13 years tortured the Muslims, killed some of them, driven them out of Makkah. They were even plotting to kill the Prophet ﷺ, and then they had waged so many wars against the Muslims, even when they went to Medina. Despite that, once Muslims had the upper hand, the Prophet had the upper hand, what was his example? That's the example that we have to follow. We don't have to follow anybody's wishes or whims or whatever. So I think in that context, when we see that the Prophet ﷺ gave us an example of compassion, but compassion coming from a basis of justice. And that's what we ought to be aiming for. Now, when we apply this situation to the problem in Pakistan, I said repeatedly, I don't subscribe to the Taliban ideology. I think their ideas are very obscurantist, etc. But I don't have to live under their conditions. But at the same time, let us be honest. Regrettably, the political leadership in Pakistan, whether it's civilian or military, etc., does not give me much confidence either. I mean, I feel pained to have to say this, but they're not honest either. So, it's not enough to say, well, the Taliban might break an agreement. The government of Pakistan, successive governments have repeatedly broken their agreements. They repeatedly violate the constitution. We need to hold them accountable for their actions and deeds before we go around to some remote village in North Waziristan and insist that those people ought to live according to our conditions and our demands. If Pakistan really is such a moderate society, then I'm afraid the first aspect of moderation ought to be some social and economic justice. Regrettably, Pakistan is full of injustices. There is extreme poverty. I mean, for the first time in my life, when I read it, I was horrified that now Muslim families are committing suicide because of poverty. It's a disgrace for Muslims. Pakistan is not a poor country. It is poorly governed and poorly managed. And this is what we need to sort out.
Hi. I actually have comments and then probably I'll turn them into questions. For you, you mentioned that you think there are some well-wishers, I would say, for militants in the system, especially within the army or ISI. I wonder how is it possible? I mean, they are directly at war with Pakistani army and ISI. When I say they, TTP, they're killing them, beheading them. They killed Colonel Imam, they killed Khalid Khwaja, all of those people that you would have said probably they were the well-wishers, but they ended up being beheaded by the same people. Do you think, is it possible that the army or the ISI has well-wishers within them? First that, and then Sir Bangash, I almost thought that you were doing very great until you said that Pakistan army could not win a war. Or I thought you were actually questioning the competence of the army. I think if you are from Hangu, Kakul isn't very far. Had you had a look at even a single day routine of the cadets, you wouldn't question the competence of the Pakistani army. Probably what you were trying to say, correct me if I'm wrong, is how the dictators work or how the military leadership fails to achieve its goal, not the institution itself. And thirdly, and I have a question, so same question would be, do you really think that the army is so incompetent that they couldn't win a war, or they would not win a war given the circumstances? Thirdly, I would ask both of you, what makes you think that that the Taliban want to impose their beliefs on us? Because had it been for beliefs, we hadn't had any issues while we were fighting the Soviets. These people were as militarized, these people were as extremists, but they hadn't turned their backs onto Pakistan first. Secondly, had it been for beliefs, for SWAT people specifically, they've been sort of fighting for their judicial system that we changed in the 70s sometime. Why did they not have these sort of Taliban ways of doing things before 2006? Had it been for beliefs, they would have done the same thing since 70s rather than just wait for 2006 and do the same things for their beliefs to be imposed on us. Or so, and my question to you is, do you really think it's Sharia that they want to impose on the rest of the Pakistan? The real thing is, and for last comment that I would like to make is, rest assured that Sharia is not the topic on the talk tables anymore. It's already been sorted out, and that's where the negotiations actually started. They have agreed that Sharia, if at all, would be within the scope of FATA only. The other thing is that what they really call Sharia is there's local system, as Sir Bangash said, the judicial system and how they live and whatnot. Sharia, when we talk of Sharia, it's not the Sharia or the Islamic Sharia we're talking about. Thank you very much.
So this was a long question and directed at a bunch of people. I'd like to kind of like span across, and if you guys have any comments, kind of make them then.
Okay, just
quickly, the point is that certainly the kinds of cases that you refer to would create enemies within the Pakistani military towards the Taliban. But it cannot be denied that both ISI and the military help to breed extremism, militancy in Pakistan. And it serves their purposes. Insurgency groups to fight in Kashmir, fight India. The creation and the breeding and the supporting of militancy and extremism is part of the internal and external vested interests. Both internal interests and external interests. Internal interests of intelligence agencies and some within the military, not the whole military, and probably not all of the ISI, but within them there are vested interests that want to breed militancy and extremism. I think the Taliban are part of that consequence of militancy and militancy that was bred. Now we call it blowback. You give rise to something which comes back and haunts you. So now it might be that the Pakistani military and the Taliban are opposed to one another. It wasn't always like that. These are the negative consequences of the actions that you did 20, 30, 40, 20, 30 years ago.
Let me first of all clarify with respect to the geography. Hangu is in a different area from Kakul. Kakul is in Abbottabad. Incidentally, I've been to Kakul, Pakistan Military Academy many times. In fact, many of my friends were in the military, and I studied in Lawrence College, Pakistan, which is considered to be a military factory. It produces, military officers, and I joke with my friend that, we have done a lousy job of producing you guys. You haven't done anything substantial. I know that the cadets up to, in fact, the rank of colonels in the Pakistan Army are very competent officers. It is beyond that that the problem arises. And I'll tell you why it arises, because after the stage of a colonel, then it's all basically who you know in the army. It's not competence. And I'm not saying this. I can quote to you military officers. One of them, a very good friend of mine, Colonel Zafar, who wrote a beautiful book. It's called The Conspiracy of Silence and the Policy of Surrender. And in that, we published that book. In that, he is brutally frank about the betrayal of the top military officers in Pakistan, both in the 1965 war as well as the 1971 war. And I'd recommend it to everybody to please read it, because it comes from a highly decorated military officer himself. He was head of the commandos in Pakistan, and he wrote this, and he said how the top echelon of the Pakistan military betrayed Pakistan repeatedly. Now let me give you the example of why I say that the Pakistan military has not won a single war. There were 3 wars that the Pakistan military fought. 1948 in Kashmir, 1965 again over Kashmir, but then India attacked Pakistan and it flared up into a full-scale war, and then 1971. Now look at the results of all 3 wars. In fact, the only time that Pakistan made any gains was in 1948. And you know why it was? Because the tribal people, the very same tribal people that are today being attacked by the Pakistan army, were the ones that went into Kashmir and took over some parts of Kashmir, which is today called Azad Kashmir. It wasn't the Pakistan army that took that land. In 65, we were told, I was a student in Pakistan, we used to hear these fantastic stories about, Pakistan army having made these gains and that gains, and ultimately when we saw the truth, we found out that it was actually a stalemate, nothing else. And then they had to, it was the Americans that actually forced Pakistan to stop the war, otherwise they would not give them spare parts. Many officers were very, very upset about this, bitterly upset about this, because they felt that they had an opportunity after they had blunted the Indian army attack. This is actually Colonel Zafar saying this. He said after they blunted the Indian army attack, the Pakistan army was ready to go and on the counter-offensive, but the top officers, betrayed the country. For whatever reason, we don't know. But this is something that is on record. It's not something hidden. And of course, we know what happened in 1971. It was a disaster. It was a disgrace. In fact, in the 1971 war, my own uncle, he was an officer, he was a captain in the army, 23-year-old. He died in Kashmir. But I'm not talking about the young officers. I'm talking about the top echelons who betrayed the country. And they continue to do it for their own benefits. They don't care, unfortunately, for the people. That's where the problem of Pakistan lies.
So I would just like to read the question if I got it right. So your first question was that why are the Taliban against trying to impose Sharia now and not before? Was that your first question?
What makes you think that it's the beliefs, or if their belief systems that they're imposed on them, which is the problem?
Right. So the question is that what? Right. Right. Okay. So firstly, I think the Taliban were created by us in the 1980s when the US ascended there. So I think there was a kind of camaraderie between the army and the Taliban at that point. So because the Taliban were created by the army and they were being funded by the army and trained by the army and being sent to Afghanistan, so I think at that point the relationships were good, even though the ideologies may have differed. And the aim was to have the Soviets back out of Afghanistan at that point. So even if the ideologies were different, the purpose was same. So I think that's why at that point Taliban weren't really attacking us. And I think what happened was that after that, when the war died down, the common objective was finished, and by the 2000s, the Taliban then, because the ideology was to impose Sharia, turned on us. I think that, and then Pakistan had to go against them because we had to ally with the US on war of terror. So I think it's a case of Pakistan first supporting Taliban and then going against them for its own purposes. So that's the first thing. And the question was, how do we know that Taliban wants to impose the Sharia? I'm not sure, but I think they've said they want to impose the Sharia. They don't say they want to impose the Sharia?
They want to change the constitution. That's the first thing that's being
That they want to, but from what I know, haven't they had, I could be wrong on this, but I think they have had objections to a lot of things. Like, I'm not sure, but I know for a fact that a lot of Taliban people do have problems with, for example, outside FAR as well, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, with a lot of things which may not be considered Sharia, for example, clothing or other issues like that. That's what I've seen, but I could be wrong. Have you not seen? I'm from. I can quote a personal example. The guy who works in my home is from Kohat, which is not exactly Fatah. It's in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, if not correct. And he says that the Taliban who are there have recruited, for example, his brother, something. They have issues with women and their clothing. Now, this could be considered more of a Pashtun code than Taliban, but the Taliban do try to impose it in that sense. So I think, yes, sir.
Taliban were the Afghanistan
Yeah.
They were done they came to power in 1996, right? And then until 2006, we hadn't had any issues. All these sorts of issues we hadn't had. Why do you think they're just coming back on us right now? And not in 1996 when they were in power?
They might know more, but isn't because in 1996 we were supporting them? Our government was pro-Taliban in Afghanistan as well in 1996.
Yeah, so still they would have come back and said, "Oh, I object to this. I object to your way of clothing. I want to impose Sharia here." But they were our friends.
But at that point it was a mutual benefit, right? We were supporting the government, we were funding them, so.
It's not the Sharia that's the politics.
Yeah, maybe deep down it is
That's
politics,
all
right?
I'm saying. It's not Sharia.
So what? Maybe at the core you're saying is the politics.
Yes.
So yes, perhaps at the core it is politics, but the projection that they're putting outside is that they want the reasons that they give from outside is imposing of the Sharia.
Yeah, I agree to that.
Yeah,
the reason that they're
from the
projecting
outside?
is that,
Yeah.
but it's not the reason. All I'm saying is
So
that.
the reason is politics and power.
Yes.
So what do you think is the solution for that?
Solution is talks.
And giving them power?
No, talks. Because we are in the well, if you actually ask me how to do the talks, we are in the position to do the talks because they are just at the verge of just dying down.
Mm-hmm.
America pulls out, Afghani Taliban or whoever is fighting there, they come into power or do whatever sort of arrangement within the to come into the power.
Mm-hmm.
TTP does not have a role to play in the region, so that's why they're on the table. They want the talks, not the Pakistani military or the Pakistani government.
Right.
They are there just because, well, not the government. They're just there because they're dragged into it. But military didn't want. Well, military is also somewhat on different pages. But all I'm saying is that TTP is the one who wants the talks.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it's going on. For the longest time, I've been thinking that they wouldn't come for the talks, but they did come for the talks. And the only thing that I could make out of it is that they are just worried about their survival or even their stay in the region because they would just die down once this whole thing pulls out. I mean, America pulls out, whatever comes in Afghanistan, Pakistan, India goes out, their role just dies down. TTP, nobody's going to give a damn about them.
So can I just ask a question? When you say India goes out, are you saying India's influence out of Afghanistan goes away or in Pakistan goes away?
In Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan goes away. So you're saying when America goes out, Taliban would be strengthened or weakened?
The Afghani Taliban, they are already strengthened. That's why they're sort of pulling out and whatnot.
So how would that affect the Pakistani Taliban?
It would totally affect them because Mullah Umar does not endorse the Pakistani Taliban, or at least their ideology of how they go about women and bomb blasts and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't endorse them, and they've actually come out not in a way. I'm not to be taken as if I'm a supporter of either of them. I'm just stating a facts here that he's given a fatwa or whatever he called it that TTP shouldn't do all this, and he's even declared somewhat on some groups he's declared war on them, and they're they're fighting with each other as well. So TTP wouldn't have a role in the region. That's why they're on the talk tables.
Right. So would you say that the TTP is the one who's in the weaker ground and wants to talk?
Yes, and we need to make the best out of it.
So can I say, just for the sake of debate, that if TTP is on the weaker ground, and so we should basically, you're saying we should basically impose our will on them, and because we have a stronger footing?
Not.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to cut you guys off a little bit. So I don't know if you have any closing remarks. I'm so sorry.
Okay, I'll just end with a concluding remark.
Yeah, that's
that
fine.
if they, for the sake of debate, I can argue about, but if they are on the weaker footing and they want to come to the table, then yes, I think we should go on the table and talk.
So do you have any? Or we can kind of.
Something.
Okay. So I don't know if there's any. Okay, one more question. Okay, so there's two more questions. Okay, but and the speakers will be available during the charity dinner for you guys to ask personal or specific questions. But we are running late and we might need to wrap up. So I'm just going to take one more question and then we'll relay the rest ones to specific speakers. Hi, thank you for the great debate. I wanted you guys to consider the role of the elites and the role of the elites of Pakistan in the past 60 years. And my definition of terror is not just the butchering of heads, but it's also the lack of education and the economic terror that the elite has been subjugating the population. And I feel like for the first time, this of the 60 years of Pakistan's history, I would suppose majority in Canada belong to that sector. We have directly been affected by, by the same kind of circumstances that the normal population, the general population, they have been subjected for the past 60 years. So the last 5 years, elites have personally experienced this, what the public has been experiencing for the past 60 years. And we need to recognize this, and we need to show some sort of empathy to, accept where we are at fault. We are the problem. It's not, these are the reactions that we are seeing, and the bulk of our anger should be at the elites, at us. I don't know if you would consider that aspect. And for the Afghan Taliban, for sure, Afghan Taliban Mullah Umar changed his organization's name because they wanted to dissociate with this TTP. So, that's a good point that the person raised. So is there anybody that wants to directly respond? Okay.
I believe that does blow the lid off this whole thing. Our main problem is our social economic setup. It is the elites. It is the high level of poverty and the ridiculous levels of illiteracy. If you were to take care of those problems, things such as extremism or militantism would not seep into our society. So yes, that is probably what brings us all together on one point, that we need to take care of our own. To put it, I don't think I can put it any simpler than that. Thank you for the comment.
I would agree with them. The elite, I think that is one major difference, that there's a lot of class difference in Pakistan. We don't have that much of a middle class, I think. We have a upper class and a really lower class, and there's a difference in there's a complete difference in the whole mindset of them, which leads to, I think, this big conflict of ideology. It leads to big conflict. I think a lot of factors play into it. For example, a person in Islamabad would be completely, there would be no parity between him and a person in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, for example, who's being terrorized by Taliban. So in that case, yes, that would be a problem, but I think a lot of factors come into it, like politics and everything else, so I don't think it's something that can be solved directly. For example, corruption could be a problem for that. The people in power would be a problem for that. So that is a problem, but I don't think it would be something which we solve. It would be solved, I think, with the evolution of the democratic process. Thank you.
Okay, so was there one last question? Do you want to go?
Okay, first point, I don't know who is in current situation of Pakistan. Maybe dialogue works when there are two parties, but if we see the situation of Pakistan, we see that government first takes care of the terrorists, and then they support the terrorists, and then now they are going to negotiate with the terrorists. So who is talking to whom? It's not clear. So terrorists are talking to terrorists. So what's going on? And Mr. Bangash gave example of Hezbollah. I don't have any evidence, or I don't know if Hezbollah ever have done any dialogues with Israel, and when they have fought with Israel, there were no dialogues. So maybe dialogues can work if there are two parties, and if one party agrees to respect the dialogues. Okay, my question is, we have been given the examples of Spain and Ireland, but are we considering the similarities and differences of the military, the terrorists in Ireland and Spain, and the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan? So there must be some differences of their background, their objectives, what they want to achieve. So what are the similarities that make us think we can take the examples of dialogue in Spain and Ireland and then we can implement in Pakistan? And the second question is, why we have only two choices of direct attack and the dialogues? Are there any more choices, or are there any other course of action we can take other than the direct dialogue or the direct action? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Quickly, as I mentioned in the conclusion, the form of terror will vary from place to place and from time to time, but the underlying content is essentially the same, which is the need for recognition. So the issues in Ireland and Spain are very different than the issues in Pakistan. But when parties engage in terror, and this is what the debate is about, is that you have a TTP that is engaging in terrorism. How do we respond to it, through dialogue or through direct action? The point I'm saying is, underlying terror is the need for recognition and legitimacy. And that is exactly the same. The IRA wants to be recognized. The TTP wants to be recognized. The ETA wanted to be recognized by the state, to be recognized as a legitimate entity. It doesn't mean that you agree with what they're doing, but to recognize their right to exist and to be heard. The second point is a question about, aren't there any other possibilities? Well, I mean, that's the nature of the debate format, is to take these two positions and to play up the extremes of each side of them, so that precisely this middle option becomes more promising. And I think our moderator pointed that out at the very beginning. I think also the debate format allows people to say certain things that they may not believe in, but that need to be said. So for instance, I might have put forward ideas that I didn't entirely believe in, but I think needed to be said. Same as my partner Junaid and Saad would have said things that they may not hold, but in this format you can say things without thinking that I'm going to be held responsible for that. So there is some merit in having a debate that pushes two extreme positions, and you'll have noticed in the chart, what happened was, before you saw there was 14 people who supported direct action and 13 peace talks, and then a whole bunch of undecided. And after the debate, only one person changed their mind from direct action. That's what surprised me. More people who were committed to direct action did not change their mind. So, maybe that's ineffectiveness on our positions, but we did get those who were undecided. Some people who were in the middle changed their mind. And maybe that's the effectiveness of this kind of debate. Thank you.
So I'd just like to close it off by saying thank you. Okay, so I'm so sorry.
The Hezbollah situation. Hezbollah obviously was fighting an external enemy that has occupied Lebanese territory. And if there was going to be dialogue, there was in fact indirect dialogue between Hezbollah and Israel through the UN. I mean, there have been several United Nations resolutions. For instance, there's a very clear United Nations Resolution 725 that it calls for Israel to withdraw from all of the Lebanese territory that Zionist Israel has occupied. But when Israel refused to do that, then Hezbollah was left with no choice but to enforce its right to secure the liberation of its land. And there are still areas of Lebanon under Zionist occupation, the Shiva farms and other areas of South Lebanon. And so that's why Hezbollah continues to struggle to secure its rights. So in a sense, there was an indirect dialogue, but it was Israel that did not fulfill its part of the bargain. And when it did, then there was no choice left for Hezbollah to take action.
Okay, so thank you so much to our speakers, especially thank you to Junaid, who I know came in last minute. I'd also like to thank you guys for all being here and making this event possible. Also to our volunteers, SJP is nothing without the great amount of people that come and work every semester, especially our president, Rida, and Amal and Osama and everybody that I'm forgetting. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, which include WPIRG and Saad, that also made this happen. Okay, so there is a charity dinner later on, and I'd also like to mention that Dr. Zafar Bangash has books on sale in the back, so take a look at those. And we have honorariums for our speakers, gift bags that we're going to bring up now. So again, thank you so much for your insight. So we invite all of you guys to stay for dinner. It's $10 and the proceeds all go to charity. And it smells really good. So thank you so much.